do now want to shuffle the try play. Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old, and today I'm talking about the new album from Venetian Snares. She began to cry tears of blood which became little brick houses when they hit the ground. Venetian Snares is the main alias for Aaron Funk, a Canadian IDM artist, veteran on the Planet Mu label, and credited with having invented the genre of breakcore. Or at least popularized it. I don't remember if he was the inventor. This is a guy I've known about for a long time, being the IDM enthusiast that I am, but of course I've never really bothered to really look into what he had to offer, and there are a few reasons for my hesitance towards this guy. For one thing, I've never been super into these noisier styles all that much. And just from the way Funk presents his various albums, everything looked to be incredibly nihilistic and edgy and way out of my typical comfort zone. And the other reason I was intimidated by him, aside from his aggressive presentation, was the fact that he had an insanely large output. He has upwards of like 20-some albums, and as we all know, I have a regular segment on this channel where I go down an artist's entire previous back catalog before reviewing a new album proper. And I still plan on going through with the segment, but given how I was so intimidated by this back catalog, I did something I haven't really done before. I deliberately skipped a whole bunch of albums. I still listen to, I think, 13 of his previous albums, which is still a lot, but if one didn't look that interesting to me, I didn't bother with it. You can feel free to yell at me if I skipped your favorite Venetian Snares album, but these videos are already usually have just as much prelude as they do review, and I didn't want to spend too much time on this, so yeah, whatever. I'm now gonna go through a decent enough chunk of his discography so far. Okay, I went into this expecting to really not like it, and that didn't happen. I mean, it can get atonal and noisy sometimes. Most of the time. Not surprising given how every track on here supposedly shows a spectrogram of pictures of his cats, a la the Equation track by Aphex Twin. But it isn't nearly as harsh or out there as I thought it would be, still very much sticking to his IDM roots. Similar enough to RDJ for me to be able to understand it, but different enough that he's not a ripoff. Fairly promising start, I'd say, even though it's only his solo start on the Planet Mu label and far from his first release, but whatever. This one's a bit of a mixed bag. There's some tracks on here like Fuck Off, which was exactly the kind of noisy experimental stuff I expected to get with this guy, and of course didn't really enjoy much. But there was more that I liked than didn't like. Hell, there were even tracks like Banana Seat Girl and We Are Oceans that I even loved. So even if I don't love it all the way through, there's a lot more straightforward enjoyment to be had here than I thought there was going to be, so thumbs up on this one for sure. This one's a lot more consistent than the last, really trying to set up this spooky atmosphere and doing pretty well with it. It's a little on the long side though, and I didn't get a lot of visceral emotional reaction out of it, but I can see this becoming a grower with repeat listens down the road. This one's a lot more lighthearted and brings in a lot of hip-hop and jazz elements. Pretty cool, I'd say. Reminds me of Square Pusher in some areas. Basically, this is the most elaborate Outtaker homage I've ever heard. One that nearly perfectly emulates both the stuff I like and don't like about those guys, so take that how you will. Okay, this was the first one I was specifically looking forward to listening to, having sampled through it a long time ago, and it's easily my favorite thing from the guy to date. It's a lot of, like, what sounds like live orchestral sounds going up against his usual manic breakbeat manipulation, and in a way that doesn't come off as a ripoff of the Richard D. James album, despite obvious inspiration there. So, yeah, definitely worth people's time. I almost skipped this one purely because of the album cover, but one guy on Twitter stopped me, and this turned out to be surprisingly pretty enjoyable, varied, and well-crafted. Not huge on the ending of the last track, but again, this was a lot better than I thought it would be. Well, this brought in some occasional chiptune elements, but as I kinda suspected at this point, it's not precisely gleeful. It's the kind of glee that is, you say in, like, the demented cartoon villain voice, like, cavalcade glee and Dada's happy hardcore pom-poms. I am maybe starting to pick up on a bit of a formula with this guy, though. These are starting to kind of sound pretty similar. This is basically the Hungarian album again, with fewer beats and more focus on the orchestral stuff. I'm down for that. Similar to the Chocolate Wheelchair album, albeit more serious. A lot of hip-hop elements and a really gritty and dirty vibe overall, so it's pretty good. And this one is even more atonal and noisy, to the point of it not really being my thing much. But it's got plenty of crazy acid synths a la Exit Planet Dust, so it's not completely out of my comfort zone. Probably not going to come back to this, but I had some fun with it. And this one is primarily characterized by Funk himself doing his best David Bowie impression on most of the tracks. I'm not entirely sure how I feel about it. Honestly, he's not nearly as terrible a singer as some people have made him out to be, but he is very clearly trying to sound like Bowie. I suppose it works. Kind of going back to an old school analog gear sound with a more recent Avex Twin kind of style, I think. But still delivering on the usual dark and noisy stuff he usually does. Quite frankly, would much rather go back to this over Cheetah. Enjoyed this quite a bit. Which brings us to here. I realize that people are going to get mad at me about not listening to all the albums of Feet, which, honestly, after going through all of these, seems far less daunting now. Maybe I'll probably listen to those later. Meathole pleasantly surprised me, so I can't imagine the ones that I actually skipped are that bad. Well, actually, I did preview and skim through the albums I missed on his Bandcamp page. I probably would have been able to get into Doll Doll Doll, My So-Called Life, and Thank You for Consideration just fine. The former I honestly really only skipped because of the album cover and subject matter, and the latter two didn't look like anything outstanding from how some people were talking about it. Some stuff though, like Print F, Shiver in Eternal Darkness, Making Orange Things, and Winnipeg is a Frozen Shithole, absolutely did not sound appealing to me at all. But hey, if those are your favorites from the guy, that's cool. That style just isn't my thing. It's all a bit much. At least from the stuff I heard, I am at least convinced that this dude is a really creative guy, and one that was a lot more listenable than I expected him to be going into him for the first time. I'm not all that engaged whenever his music traverses into some, like, gabber, hardstyle sort of territory, whatever you want to call that kind of music, with the loud, distorted kick drums that drown, like, all the details out. And the guy also abuses amen breaks to high heaven like few other artists I've seen, but hey, I like me some good amen breaks. And I like how most of these albums seem to bring something new to the table that others didn't. I mean, not all of them, but there's a lot of variety from album to album, and there were a lot of keepers here. So going into this new album, I felt like I knew what the percussion tracks were vaguely going to sound like, but any other details beside that were a mystery. Like I said, nearly every album this guy's made sounds different, so precisely what I'd get out of this could be anything, really. So I just kind of jumped right into it. What did we get out of She Began to Cry Tears of Blood, which became a more ridiculous album title every time I say it out loud? I think I like it, but I don't think I have particularly detailed thoughts on this thing. This album does its best to set up one really consistent atmosphere, but I cannot, for the life of me, tell any of the 12 tracks apart. That isn't just me throwing out an excuse to not have to say all the ridiculously long titles of every track. I was actually kind of hoping to be able to, since that'd make for so much more of an entertaining video. I mean, just look at these titles. The shriek she made when she died was erased by the sound of lightning. He was shot by one of Brian's children holding the cats hostage in a cardboard box. She spoke to it through a clock radio in a dream and woke as a cloudburst obliterating her civilization. Someone painted a giant paperclip on the sidewalk right where you fell. He secretly collected tragedies under the guise of learning from past mistakes and moving forward, but then he became a crooked steeple in a dusty old snow globe that nobody had ever turned over in years. Hard luck. If only he were to say school bus yellow 17 times and then say your own name and cry. These are amazing titles, and this would have made for a hilariously convoluted review video. Unfortunately, like I said, basically all of these tracks sound nearly exactly the same to me. There's some variation in the percussion pattern, some tracks have more pronounced synths and some are more understated, but every track is kinda building to the exact same consistent sound. And there's not even any melodies anywhere that could possibly stick in your head or even allow these tracks to distinguish apart from each other in the way something like traditional synthesizer music accomplished. Maybe the second track would be a good pick for my favorite given how the synths popped out a bit more and I was more engaged than the others on here, but it's barely any different sounding from everything else on here. Not to mention, there's basically, like, no element of repetition here either. There's no distinguishable patterns in the synths or the percussion, no regular set beats or even time signatures that I can pick up on. Sounds just kind of happen in a complete random mishmash. And yet, even though I may sound like I'm speaking negatively on this album, I don't think the complete lack of structure anywhere necessarily works against the album. Makes it really hard to talk about, obviously, but In the end, everything is working towards this one singular atmosphere that I think is actually pretty well executed. Everything is soaked in reverb, and there's not much that's, like, super noisy and harsh on the ears. We end up with this really spacey and spooky atmosphere that's surprisingly really immersive. It's really metallic and atonal, as I mentioned, kinda like his previous album Huge Chrome Cylinder Box Unfolding, but less of an obvious Audica ripoff. I mean, not that this isn't the kind of thing that Audica would do, it totally is. But I don't think they really have something quite like this yet. Maybe there's some moments on Elsec that sound kinda like this, but even there, every track is, like, so much more distinct, there's more structure and some actual melodies there. It's not all pure atonality. Or maybe its lack of structure is more like certain moments on Draft 7.30 or Confield, but the atmosphere is a lot stronger here than it was there. More like Monolake's Momentum or something, but obviously Monolake stuff is so much more accessible and follows actual traditional rhythmic structures. But yeah, despite some clear similarities to artists I'm already familiar with, as far as I know, this album showcases a world entirely of Aaron Funk's own invention. And like I said, I do very much enjoy it. The percussion, while spastic and abstract as always, is never too harsh that it turns me away. It's all really detailed and interesting as you would expect out of the guy. The melodies, as I said, are covered in reverb and are given lots of space and time to breathe, and even if they are completely abstract. I really don't know what else there is to say on the subject of this album in the end. Is it among my favorites overall in the whole Venetian Snares catalog? I don't know, really. Do I see myself coming back to it with a ton of frequency? Possibly, but not that much. I mean, there is replay value there, and I do have a spot in my life for this kind of abstract material. It appeals to me just enough for me to want to come back to it, but I could name plenty of other albums I've already heard from the guy and from other artists that I'd more likely want to come back to and have more for me to enjoy. It's not the most incredible thing I've heard in my life, but it is a very unique and interesting release in his catalog. If all I've said sounds appealing to you, or you're just a big fan of this guy in general, this is certainly worth your time. And one thing you certainly cannot say is that Venetian Snares is treading water. I mean, this dude is continually pushing himself into new territory, and this album is another good example of this. Maybe not necessarily the best place to start if you're going into him for the first time, but you could basically start wherever the hell you like. Regardless, I did have fun listening to this, and I'd say it's worth a shot. I think I'm overall feeling 7.5 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.